This programme is about the village of Magna, its history and the village of today. It is written and presented by Ian and Mary Durham and introduced by the bells of Magna Parish Church. Magna is a charming little village, only 7 miles to the south of Bristol and 12 from Bath. But the village itself is in a truly rural setting, surrounded by fertile agricultural land, dotted with farmhouses, many of which were built hundreds of years ago. The one big change in the locality in recent years is the creation of the Chew Valley Lake in 1953, only a mile to the south. This reservoir provides water for Bristol, but has added a beautiful amenity to the area, with boating, fishing, some of the best in the country, and a bird sanctuary. People have lived in the valley of the River Chew for thousands of years, and we have ample evidence of their being here. The village of Magna is surrounded by prehistoric sites, such as this one at Stanton Drew, 2 miles away. It is a large monument of standing stones, arranged in circles, one of which is 100 yards across. It was built about 4,000 years ago, at roughly the same time as Stonehenge, for some ritual purpose. A little to the north, on the high ground above Stanton Drew, is Maze Knoll, an Iron Age fortified settlement, probably occupied about 500 years BC. This large, man-made hillock is only the most obvious part of the earthwork which encloses a site of several acres. The Romans were in the Chew Valley for the first 3 or 4 centuries AD. They mined silver and lead in the Mendip Hills and smelted and refined it at several places in the valley. There was at least one Roman villa at a spot now under the lake, and the well on the site was still being excavated as the water rose to fill the new reservoir. Here are the archaeologists at work. And here are some of the items found down the well. A copper vessel with an iron handle, half a Samian ware bowl with a pattern of dolphins and ivy leaves, and a Roman brooch, probably dropped by the owner while drawing water. But that's enough about the distant past. Let us look at the village in more modern times.
Magna is, in most respects, a very ordinary village. It has not provided the background for any epoch-making event in British history, has not produced any national hero, and does not contain any architectural masterpiece. It has been, throughout the centuries, a small community which has been very typical of English rural life. The charm and character of the village result firstly from the gradual development of this community from Saxon days to the present, and secondly from the fact that, even in recent years, when so many villages have lost their old identities, this particular one has escaped any large-scale destruction or expansion. Modernization has taken place, but usually while retaining the best of the old. And the additions have generally been on quite a limited scale, and so placed that they have been incorporated into the old village without disharmony. Magna, or as it has sometimes been called Bishop's Chew, or Chew Episcopi, has long been the main town in the valley. It was so established in late Saxon times, and we know that the manor of Chew existed before the Norman conquest. In 1062, Edward the Confessor, here portrayed in the Bayeux tapestry, granted it to his chaplain Guizot, and appointed him Bishop of Wells. This grant was not interfered with by the invasion of William of Normandy, and so for the next 350 years the village and the surrounding land was part of the personal domain of successive bishops of Bath and Wells. A Domesday book in 1086 recorded that there were 3,600 acres of cultivated land in the manor, of which the bishop kept 1,200 acres for his own use and farmed them with 53 workers, who varied from slaves to freemen. The remainder was rented out to about 50 tenant farmers, who, in addition to the rent, would pay a tithe of 1/10 of what they produced to the bishop. There were 5 mills for grinding corn, the 3 most highly rated belonging to the bishop, and the tenant farmers had to take the corn they produced to his mill to be ground, and pay for the privilege. They would also pay heriot or fines on the death of a tenant, or when daughters married. The best ox was a very usual heriot.
Almost certainly, much of the cultivated land was organised on the usual 3-field system of feudal days, and in a survey of the land holdings in the village in 1615, there are repeated references to plots of land, usually of several acres, in the west, north and east fields. It can be calculated that in the early Middle Ages, the 11th and 12th centuries, there would be 500 to 600 people living in the area of the manor, but many of them on outlying farms. The village itself, with a population of 200 or 300, would be quite small, and the primitive houses would be closely grouped round the manor house, the present Chew Court, where most of the inhabitants would work. The temporal and ecclesiastical powers were concentrated in the regime of the bishop, who was both rector and lord of the manor. But the bishop had many other manors he could enjoy. In addition to his palace at Wells, he had 8 estates in Somerset alone. So he and his large entourage would only come to the village for short periods, perhaps 2 or 3 times a year, and then the bishop's establishment would live off the products of the home farm and off the tithe collected in his name. This field up Norton Lane, on the southern slopes of Blacklands, is still called vineyards, and is probably an area where vines were cultivated. The terracing is still quite easy to see. From these vines would be produced at least some of the wine for the bishop's household. While he was in residence, Chew Episcopi became the bishop's administrative centre. For instance, in 1315, while in residence at Chew Magna, the bishop tonsured 13 men on the Feast of the Nativity. And many important documents to do with diocesan affairs were signed here. It was from Chew Magna in 1499 that Bishop Oliver King issued instructions to the Prior of Bath to proceed with the building of Bath Abbey. The bishop, or in his absence his steward or bailiff, dealt with local disputes and with the minor wrongdoings of the local inhabitants. He would impose fines, whippings, it could be through the streets or at the whipping post, and other punishments. The stocks and the pillory were to be found in every village, and we have heard that those for Chew Magna were to be seen within living memory on the north side of the old schoolroom. After the Reformation, and especially after the death of Henry VIII in 1547, there was considerable pressure exerted by the state on the church to hand over the manors. Chew Episcopi was one of a large number of manors sold by Bishop Palo to the Duke of Somerset in 1548. And it was possibly at that time that much of the residence was demolished and the stone sold. So ended nearly 500 years of the administration of the manor of Chew by the bishops of Bath and Wells.
Let us now consider how the village has developed. The topography of Chew Magna is very significant, as this map, derived from the tithe map of 1840, shows. The village is situated on higher ground on a slight spur, between the River Chew, coming up from the south and turning eastwards, and the Winford Brook, coming in from the west and then turning south to join the river. Probably the first settlement grew up here because the river could be crossed nearby. The all-important Tun Bridge on the south of the village is almost certainly medieval. That is to say, it was built before about 1500 AD. The name tun is the Old English word for farmstead, later used for village or manor. Perhaps a few words about the meaning of the name Chew could be appropriate here. It is found scarcely anywhere else, but there are several possible derivations and meanings. For example, winding water, which seems to be a very appropriate one. However, the latest thinking seems to agree with Eckwell that it is derived from the Welsh chew, meaning the young of an animal or chicken, so that Afon Chew would mean the river of the chickens. Perhaps it was. The river and the stream have always been important factors in the life of this community. The leats, that is, the cuttings made to channel the water from points higher upriver down to the mill wheels, must have been dug in Saxon or Norman times, and the tithe map of 1840 shows 4 of them, of which we still have 3 remaining today. Over the centuries, the mills have reflected the changes in the social and economic structure of the village. The feudal corn mills became fulling mills, associated with the cloth industry in the late Middle Ages, and at about the time that the very close connection with the bishops was coming to an end, Leyland wrote, "Chute is a pretty clothing town. There had been good making of cloth in the town." Wills of the period substantiate this. In 1543, Richard Parsons of Chew left to his son Thomas a narrow loom, if so be he goes to the weaving craft, or else to go to one of his younger brothers, after the discretion of my wife. We also know that it was from a clothmaker's family in Chew Magna that John Champness came, and he was Lord Mayor of London and was knighted in 1534. The woolen industry certainly left its mark on some of the local field names like Flaxacre and Tuckingmead, and when the cloth industry declined, the use of the mills changed again. They turned over to making pots and pans and agricultural tools. But whatever was made at the mills, they provided considerable opportunities for employment and were very important in the village economy.
Our village of today is still a compact one and has not spread far beyond the bounds of the medieval community. The main buildings of the original settlement are still at the centre of it, as this up-to-date map shows. So, as we now look at buildings, we will start with a group of medieval ones in the centre of the village. They are ringed in green on this map, and taking them as they are numbered, we have number 1, the Church of St Andrew, mainly 14th and 15th centuries, and number 1A, the steps and shaft of the old stone preaching cross in the churchyard. Number 2, the former church house, now known as the Old Schoolroom, built at the end of the 15th century. Number 3, Chew Court, parts of which are 14th and 15th centuries. This was the bishop's residence. And number 3A, the wellhead in the grounds of Chew Court, presumably of the same date. The church, Chew Court and the Old Schoolroom form an interesting complex of buildings close together on the ground and closely related in medieval times in their function. No doubt the church came first, and it is possible that Edith, wife of King Edward the Confessor, built the first church here, because she owned the manor before it was given to Guizot the bishop. The first vicar was appointed in 1191, and there is reference to a church here in a document dated 1 year later. That building was probably of wood, in which case no traces of it remain. But that was a time when rebuilding in stone was taking place. There are fragments of a Norman church, for instance, the buttresses at the east end, and the bottom of this south wall, the base moulding and the first layer of stone above. The south entrance might have been a typical Norman doorway. The lintel and the door jambs are Norman work, and it is thought this entrance lost the usual rounded arch and the chevron pattern when the porch was added later. But most of the church is of the 13th to 15th centuries of the early English and perpendicular styles. It is a large building, reflecting both the prosperity of the woolen industry and the church's own local importance. It was almost certainly a minster church, which would mean that this was a centre for a group of preachers who served the nearby communities, perhaps before their own churches were built. The tower, one of the famous Somerset type, seems to have been erected in the mid-1400s and is about 100 feet tall. There has been a clock on the tower since the early 1700s, and in 1754 we find the vestry paying 26 shillings and fourpence for repairs. The present clock, installed in 1903, plays a verse of a hymn every 4 hours, at 8 a.m., noon, 4 and 8 p.m., with a different hymn tune for each day of the week. There are now 8 bells in the tower. In 1898, 4 of these were recast and 2 were repaired to commemorate the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria the previous year. And the event was well recorded in photographs. Here we have the sexton and other local worthies. Other features to note on the outside of the church are the gargoyles. We have a good collection. And the several scratch dials. As we go into the church through the porch, notice that this had a gallery at one time, approached by 2 doorways and an outside staircase. In time past, the choir would sing from the gallery on Advent Sunday, and while parts of some services, for weddings and baptisms, were conducted in the porch before the parties entered the church.
Now for a few views of the inside of the church. Note the difference in the pillars on the 2 sides. On the right we have early English arcading. The pillars are shorter and thicker than those on the left, which are of the perpendicular style, because the north aisle beyond them was the last part of the church to be built. One of the most noticeable and attractive features is the screen, and much of this is part of the original rood screen, probably of the 15th century. The screen used to divide off the chancel, reserved for the clergy, from the nave where ordinary people gathered, and it kept the chancel separate and holy when, as happened up to the 16th century, the nave was the centre of social life in most parishes. In the nave, an open space without pews or other seating arrangements, would be held wedding feasts and harvest homes, and the church ales, which were a major source of church income in those days. Almost certainly in Magna, such activities would be moved into the old schoolroom when that was built at the end of the 15th century. But to return to the church we know, the font, everyone agrees, is Norman, and it still has the original lining of lead, no doubt mined on Mendip. Various items of church furniture and coats of arms remind us of the close link in the past with the bishops. These are the arms of Bishop Cornish, and we find them again on the side of this rare prayer desk now used as a lectern. It is thought that this was brought across from the court when that ceased to be a bishop's residence in 1548, about 50 years after the death of Bishop Cornish. As in most churches, we have the royal coat of arms placed in a very prominent position here above the chancel arch. They were first introduced into churches after the Reformation, I suppose to remind worshippers that the sovereign was now head of the church, the defender of the faith. These arms date from the time of King Charles II. The pulpit is modern, a beautiful piece of work with carvings of 6 apostles, including St. Andrew in the centre, and some intricately carved columns and birds. The Strachey Chapel, previously the St. Lo Chapel, lies at the east end of the north aisle and contains many memorials to the family which owned Sutton Court, until recently within this parish, from 1655 almost to the present day. The Stracheys have contributed much to literature and the arts, to the armed forces, and particularly to administration in India, starting with Sir Henry Strachey, who was secretary to Lord Clive. This fine heraldic window depicting St. George and St. Elizabeth of Hungary was made in 1934. In this armorial glass is shown the descent of the barons, Strachey and O'Hagan. Previous owners of Sutton Court were the St. Lo family, and the figure on the large tomb is that of Sir John St. Lo, who died in 1447, and who is supposed to have been over 7 feet tall.
Across the church is the Lady Chapel, which is still better known as the Baber Chapel because it contains the very large tomb, built in 1643, of Edward Baber, his wife, and other members of the family. The Babers lived in Chew Court and were lords of the manor from 1575 to 1662. When this tomb was introduced, the bishop's gallery was destroyed. It was in the top part of this chapel and was used by the bishop when he attended services in the church. He could enter it from his palace, which then extended to much nearer the church, by way of a bridge across the path outside and through a door which was where the upper window is now. Nearby is this very modern memorial, which commemorates Thomas Magna, who emigrated from this village in 1629 and achieved distinction in the American colonies. This monument was unveiled in September 1979, when about 80 of his descendants came back to visit the village. They then formed a Thomas Magna Society, which now has hundreds of members, most of them in North America. A second organized visit of about 140 members took place in October 1987, and close contacts have been established between members of the society and the present-day residents of the village from which their ancestor emigrated over 350 years ago. Finally, in the church, is this very unusual effigy, made of wood, and one of the very few to have survived. It is described as being of Sir John d'Hauteville, but wrongly, because the armour is of a later period. It is probably of a later member of that same family. Before we leave the vicinity of the church, let us notice 1 or 2 items in the churchyard. This shaft of a preaching cross on its steps was probably erected in the 14th century and would be used as a platform by travelling friars and other preachers eager to expound their interpretation of the Gospels to the local people. Unfortunately, the top of the cross has disappeared. The chest tombs, there are 10 of them in all, dotted about the churchyard, are of the 17th and 18th centuries and have recently been listed as of historical importance. And this gravestone is interesting, between the church tower and the old vicarage wall. It commemorates Mr. William Fowler, who was shot by a highwayman on Dundry Hill on the 14th of June 1814. And there we must leave the church Without doubt, the most significant building in the history of our village.
Chew Court was thoroughly restored in the 19th century and again in 1976, but the small gatehouse with its unusual corner turrets remains practically unchanged. When this was one of the bishop's 9 palaces, it was the manor house of the village, but it must not be confused with the building at the other end of the village, which has been called the manor house for at least 100 years. Perhaps I should point out that the manorial rights and the title Lord of the Manor can be bought and sold, and in this village they have passed several times between these 2 big houses. As was said before, Chew Court was the local administrative centre of the Bishop of Bath and Wells, and at one time the house was much bigger. During the last century, the owner made trial digs to find the foundations of the earlier house, and this plan shows the results as far as he went. Probably the original house was in the form of a quadrangle and stretched very near the church, making possible the bridge across to the bishop's gallery in the church. Among old drawings, this one, done in the 1830s, is of great interest because it shows what appears to be water in the foreground. Could this be the remains of a boat? At that time the court was occupied by a poor farmer, and the archway was filled in and used as a storehouse. The condition and status of the house have varied greatly over the years, but now it is fully restored and complemented by these beautiful gardens. It must be emphasized that the really old part of the building, almost unchanged since the days of the bishops, is the gatehouse, together with the lower part of the wall adjoining. The bottom one of these 3 windows has been dated to the 14th century. Something else survives in the grounds of the court from the days of the bishops. It is the old well which is beneath this small shelter.
At the entrance to the churchyard is the old schoolroom, as we know it today, but it has been called by many names. Often, and quite correctly, it has been called the church house. It is of late 15th or early 16th century construction and is fundamentally unchanged. This building may have been part of the bishop's estate when he was lord of the manor and used for administrative purposes. But more probably, it was built as the church house or parish meeting house. Church houses such as this, but rarely so big and impressive, were being built at the end of the Middle Ages in parishes throughout the West Country. But few survive in such excellent and unaltered condition as ours. The St. Lowe family, then at Sutton Court, seem to have had something to do with the erection of our church house, because their arms and the date 1510 could be seen until recently above the door. But the stone has weathered, the date has disappeared, and the arms will soon be difficult to identify. The old schoolroom, as it is generally known today, has had a checkered history. It was certainly a social centre for the village in the early 17th century, and we have records of church ales taking place here at that time. These church ales, organised by the church wardens and supported by other local villagers, were jolly drinking parties, and in the 15th and 16th centuries were a very considerable and very necessary source of income for church building and repairs. Until quite recently, there was a very large inglenook fireplace downstairs behind this tremendous beam, and that is where the ale was brewed. A charity school existed in the village by 1684, and it was almost certainly upstairs in the old schoolroom. According to this old drawing, done in 1829, The school shared the space with a commercial academy at one time, and downstairs was the poorhouse to accommodate the paupers of the village. This was certainly in existence by 1754, probably much earlier. There is evidence in the vestry books that the lower floor was divided into about 10 small rooms to accommodate the pauper families, and this occupation continued until the last of these was transferred to Clutton Union Workhouse at Temple Cloud about 1840. The children stayed in the building until another school was built on the far side of the churchyard in the 1890s. But the old schoolroom was used again after the Second World War for overflow classes, and this has helped to perpetuate the name.
Here is just one of the several very old drawings we have of the building. It is done by John Bucker in 1834, and it shows that part of the village in some detail, and probably very accurately. It shows a number of doors and chimneys on the south side of the poorhouse, tending to confirm the impression given by the vestry minutes of the division into small rooms. This drawing is the earliest we have of the centre of the village, and the detail is of very great interest. We think that all these buildings still exist, some behind the bank and some having been given new frontages. Another drawing 9 years later in 1843 by Wheatley is of the old schoolroom and blind house. The latter is usually a euphemism for lock-up, and certainly there are references in the records to offenders being kept here, usually only overnight, before being brought before the magistrates. Apart from the use referred to earlier for overflow classes, the building has been used this century as the village hall, with a men's club, naturally equipped with billiard tables, downstairs. But the building deteriorated so much that it had to be closed as unsafe in 1965. These pictures show how extensive were the repairs done in 1971 and 1972. The main beams carrying the upstairs floor were affected by the beetle and had to be replaced. However, the fine timber roof was saved, and it remains an excellent example of a late medieval roof. It is 11 bays long, with collar braces, arched braces, and wind braces. So the building we have inherited is really very little changed from when it was completed in 1510.
Having looked in some detail at the really old buildings which still form the centre of our village, we would like to take you, in imagination, for a tour of the rest of the village. Time will only allow a very brief glimpse of many interesting items, but we hope you will be reminded of the village you have seen, or your appetite will be whetted so that you will be encouraged to come to Magna sometime in the future. So we start at the triangle. The village maypole once stood here, and we know from the records that it was taken down in 1754 because it was then in a dangerous condition. In 1956, the tradition was revived when the Queen visited the village on the day she inaugurated the new reservoir, the Chew Valley Lake. Here is the Queen in the centre of the village. And this is what she saw. The event is now commemorated by this tree planted on the triangle. From here we see South Parade rising behind the high pavement, which is such an unusual feature of the village scene. The railings appear on the earliest photograph we have of the village centre, dated about 1880. Opposite South Parade are two of the remaining inns of the village, the Pelican and the Bear and Swan. The Pelican, an old coaching inn with some of its walls 30 inches thick, can be traced in the records back to at least 1615, but it is probably even older. The inn sign represents a ship, the Pelican, later renamed the Golden Hind, in which Drake set off in 1577 to circumnavigate the earth. The name may be a clue to the date of the building of the inn. The nearby Bear and Swan was given a new front in 1886, hence this date stone on the front. But it is almost as old as the Pelican, and the unusual name is probably the result of joining together two smaller hostelries. Almost adjoining is the pantry. Over 150 years ago, it was occupied by a baker and tallow chandler. Later, about 1900, it was owned by Miss Hutchins, whose brother took this and many other photographs on glass plates. This one shows, in front of the shop, the village pump. It was in this position until 1962, when it was removed into the garden of Harford House, where it still is. And here is a view of the inside of the grocery store. Something to awaken nostalgic memories among older folk.
Some buildings do change their appearance. Here is the Co-op as it was in 1987, and after renovations in 1988. A valiant attempt to make a very dull building look more attractive. But this is how it started at the turn of the century as the Prospect House Hotel, with an extra story, a veranda, a grim-looking landlady, and with Sonny Jim the barber plying his trade on the ground floor, open 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Looking eastwards, today we have the old schoolroom, the bank, and the hairdressers. The latter has an almost ecclesiastical appearance, not surprising, because it was a Baptist chapel early last century. Recently the baptistry, a tank lined with yellow bricks and with steps leading down into it, was found under the floor of the shop. It was just outside here that the old toll house stood until about 1880. This old photograph shows it and the toll gates, with the high pavement of Tunbridge Road in the background. Along the road to the left, called the Chalks, are old cottages including the thatch, probably built in the 17th century, and the cricket field, in a most picturesque setting, with the church and Chew Court in the background. If we return to the Co-op and turn right into Harford Square, we find one of our stately Georgian houses, Harford House, and opposite is Silver Street. We don't know why it is so called, but usually that name comes from the Latin silver, meaning a wood. Along here is Church House, and in the churchyard the enchanting Church Cottage, which used to be the sexton's home, very appropriately cited in view of his duties in the churchyard. And, of course, the Church Hall, built in 1923 and nowadays a centre for drama, craft shows and art exhibitions. In this area are several of the oldest cottages in the village, like Brook Cottages, Elm Farm and Croft Cottage. They are usually of the cross passage type, like this, having on one side of the passage the living room containing the fireplace and the spiral staircase, with a retiring room beyond, and on the other side one or two small rooms for storage and for preparation of food. The doorway of this one is so impressive that we think it might have come from Chew Court, when part of that was demolished in the 16th or 17th century. Probably several of these houses were built in the 17th century.
Returning to Harford Square and turning right into High Street, we pass the butcher's shop with its decorative tiles. Up the High Street are a number of attractive houses, and at one time every house was given the name of a tree. Igbeti was called the Myrtles, and has traditionally been the home of doctors, and still is. Next door is Dower Cottage. and opposite is Acacia House, built at the end of the 18th century, now divided into two homes. Next is the Hollies, again built about 1800 by the then vicar. The Beeches is a very handsome Georgian residence which can be dated exactly because the fire policy was issued for its completion and is dated 25th of February 1762. The Sun Insurance plaque is still on the front of the house, in a central position, just under the eaves. The house was built by Ephraim Chancellor, village schoolmaster and church warden. This village was a centre for the Quakers, and their meeting house, complete with stable for the visiting preacher's horse, was just behind the Beeches. It is now converted into a garage and kitchen. Further up the street is a row of old cottages, one of which carries the date 1764. This was the property of a mill owner, and the 1841 census tells us it was then occupied by a frying pan maker. Opposite is Staddlestones, recently acquired to be the new vicarage. The date on the front is 1679, but this is thought to be the date of a partial rebuilding. It could be a 16th century house, or rather two houses, because features such as the roof line show that it was once a pair of cottages. Walton House across the road was once the wheelwrights, as this old photograph of the gaffer and 11 of his workmen shows. On the corner of the road to Chewstoke is Woodbine Farm, and this is basically another three-roomed cross-passage house. Under the present roof are remains of an earlier one, smoke-blackened, from the time before the house had a chimney. This building could have been erected in the 15th or 16th century. Almost opposite is Battle Lane, named after a family and not a fight. And down there is the Manor House, which for nearly 50 years after the Second World War was a convent and girls' high school. It's now being converted into offices. This Gothic exterior actually dates only from the middle of the last century, but it surrounds a much older house which has an Elizabethan fireplace, much fine carving and some remarkable overmantels. It also has a priest's hole in the depths of one of the walls, a refuge in time of religious persecution, and probably used here by Quakers because the owners for many generations were members of the Society of Friends.
We can return to the centre of the village by a different route, going down the steep path called Crickback, which starts alongside the new vicarage. At the river level we find another medieval bridge and a group of very old and interesting buildings. This is Dumper's Farm, the oldest house in the village, originally a so-called longhouse, with the humans living at one end and the farm animals at the other, separated by a cross passage. The animal end has been rebuilt, but the right-hand side is original and dates from the 14th century. These smoke-blackened beams show they were in position before there was a chimney in the house. We have evidence of a very sad event taking place here at the time of the Civil War. It is recorded that in 1647, Robert Joyner, who had been appointed vicar of Magna 4 years earlier, was, I quote, barbarously dragged out of his house and hurried away to prison, where he continued in a very mean condition till the time of his death. His goods and cattle were sold and divided amongst the sequestrators. His son, daughter, and wife, being big with child, were banished to a mean house called Dumper's, situated in a low and unhealthy position on the banks of the River Chew, and there fed with swine's food, and none of the parishioners dared to give them any help. Across the lane is Dumper's cottage, which was a small mill, standing beside its leat. and the space for the water wheel is still there. Tunbridge, or Town Bridge, is medieval and has carried traffic of many kinds into and out of the village since 1500 or earlier. Adjacent is the mill, probably on the site of one of the Doomsday mills, and still having the old water wheel, sadly no longer usable. From here, if we walk along Tunbridge Road on another raised pavement, we get back to the triangle in the middle of the village, and our tour is completed. We hope it has made you feel you are getting to know a little about the village of today and its history.
And what about Thomas Magna and the village and country he left behind in 1629? We have many entries relating to the Magna family in the church registers. This is the oldest register of baptisms, marriages and burials in Chew Magna, starting in 1560. This is the title page of the book. And this is the page headed Anno Domini 1608, which contains the record of Thomas Magna's baptism. This is the entry opposite the pen, and it says, Thomas Magna, the son of Clement Magna, was baptized the 23rd day of April. In the early 17th century, the Church of St. Andrew, Chew Court, and the church house, that is our old schoolroom of today, were already more than 100 years old. Certain parts of the church much older than that, and many of the houses and farms which we know today were already in existence. Thomas could certainly have quenched his thirst at the Pelican Inn, and probably at the Bear and Swan, the two inns we still have at the centre of the village. Silver Street and the Chalks would be rows of little houses, occupied mainly by workers on the estate of the lord of the manor. By this time the bishops had been replaced in this role by the Pophams and then by the Babers. It is just possible that the house in which Thomas Magna's family lived is still occupied today. We have some houses dating back to the early 17th century. Many of the cottages would be like these, which existed in Silver Street until only a few years ago, and their roofs would be thatched. Brook cottages near the bridge almost certainly date back to the 17th century. A group of houses was being built then in the batch, including some of those cross-passage ones we referred to earlier. Parts of this one were built in the 15th century. In the Chalks, this excellent example of a small house such as was being built in Thomas Magna's day is still almost unchanged, even to its thatched roof. By 1629, clothmakers' cottages lined the high street, and some of them remain today in the very old houses on both sides of the road. But the heyday of the weaving industry was over. Foreign trade had decreased, and this caused a depression starting about 1622. The period 1629 to 1640 was a very bleak one, and although some vestige of the cloth industry survived in the village even into the 18th century, Thomas would probably see the mills in and around the village being converted to other industries. This is an attempt to show how a map of the village and its surroundings might have appeared in 1629. Much of the agricultural land would not yet be enclosed, and there would still be indications of where the medieval west, north and east fields had been, and the tracks leading to them. Even today, we still have our Westfield Lane stretching out in the right direction. Agriculture was always at the mercy of the weather, and 1629 was one of many years of bad harvests. To add to the problems, the country was still being afflicted from time to time by plague, and 1625 was just such a year, with many deaths. With so much poverty and sickness as their lot, the young in particular must have listened with interest to the stories of the lands of promise opening up across the oceans. In religion and politics also, these were troubled times. It was perhaps a spirit of inquiry rather than active dissent which was sweeping the country, a challenge which the clergy of the established church, even if present in their parishes, were not able to meet. The new James I translation of the Bible, produced in 1611, was available for people to read for themselves. And there were preachers and lecturers going round who criticised the Anglican Church for its laxity and shortcomings. Often they would not be allowed to preach in the church, and they would have to address the local people from the steps of the cross. Even during Thomas's day, the violent reaction set in, with the active persecution of the Puritans and the flight of many of them to the New World. A matter which caused much ill feeling, especially in this area, was the campaign to reduce the number of establishments selling ale and to suppress the church ales, such as were held in the church house, our old schoolroom of today. There were two reasons for the action. First, because of poor harvest, there was a shortage of grain for use in making the ale, and the intention was to reduce the demand. Second, the magistrates were concerned about the increase in lawlessness and considered that the drinking and jollification associated with the church ales, particularly on Sundays after service, were an encouragement to disorder. But these activities were some of the few pleasures available to ordinary folk, and the churches needed the income from church ales. Even the king joined in the argument with a book called The Book of Sports, and this was probably decisive in preserving the church ales for a little longer. In other ways, the king was becoming less popular and was already set on the course which would result in the Civil War and his own death a few years later. King Charles I had succeeded his father James in 1625 and was pursuing a war against Spain and France, which meant there was the ever-present danger of young men being caught by the press gangs and made to join the army or the navy. In his search for funds to finance the war, Charles came up against the unsympathetic House of Commons. So he imposed customs duties on imports and required the justices of the peace to collect forced loans from the better-off citizens. Our own local magistrate, Mr. Baber of Chew Court, was one of those who refused to act, and he was fined £77 for his disobedience. A new parliament had been summoned in 1628, and members had opened the session by presenting a petition of rights to the king. These were certainly days of increasing political tension. With the establishment of charity schools in the villages, and Chew Magna almost certainly had one in the middle of the 17th century, meeting upstairs in the old schoolroom, an increasing number of even the poorer people were literate. And among the things they read were the reports of marvelous opportunities in the New World, and the blandishments of owners and captains of ships engaged in the lucrative trade of transporting the emigrants. Certainly, in the publicity material, the opportunities were emphasized and the dangers and difficulties were played down. So, in this situation, the economically insecure, those who had doubts in religion, the aggrieved in politics, if they had the initiative and the confidence, took the course adopted by Thomas Minor. It would be very interesting to know exactly why he went.